What I intend to do, what I intend to do during this session in the next, let's say, 35, 40 odd minutes is to understand or try to understand how multilingualism worked not so far back in history. We also have to remember that in India, historically, multilingualism has always been present. So it's not something that is new. We have dealt with multiple languages. And if you go back to, for example, Sanskrit drama, even in Bhasha, for example, you will find that there are at least three languages that commingle within the same text. Depending on the character who is speaking, you will have different kinds of languages being produced by the characters. So multilingualism as a form has always been there with us. It has not been something that is new. Though I personally believe, and that therefore I've chosen this particular period of 19th century, is that something happens during this period which is also very interesting. So maybe some scholars who are there in the audience would be able to look them up, see what was happening, and then take them up as a research topic. So I'll restrict my talk today to 19th century Bengal because that's the area that I know. But I'm pretty sure that depending on the region that you're coming from, similar kinds of reverberations, similar kind of resonances might be there in your area as well. The second reason I've chosen 19th century is that there is a major intervention in the 19th century. Though you might call it, the intervention went on for some time, but in the 19th century, the intervention really took shape. And that was the colonial rule. And so one of the things that happens with colonial rule is also a kind of a disjunction of multilingualism. And we will try to understand that how that disjunctive moment appears and what happens due to what happens to the multilinguality, which is kind of, which was prevalent. And it slowly becomes, there's a kind of a separation between languages and knowledge, but we'll come to that later. So with these few comments, I do have a PowerPoint presentation, so I'll share this with you. Okay. Okay, I hope you can see the screen.
Yes,
You
sir.
can see the presentation, yeah? All right, all right. So I'll just try to make it full. Okay. So as I said, there are two aspects that I'm going to cover. I'm going to talk about multilingualism in general, but also what happens with multilingualism in 19th century Bengal. And what I'm planning to do is, this is the outline. I'll try to kind of locate what do we really mean by multilingualism in the 19th century. And by 19th century, I don't really mean the dates of 1801 to 1899, but we can travel back and forth a bit because if you remember, the colonial rule started somewhere in 1765. Calcutta as a city started getting established during that point of time. So there will be, plus minus years. And of course, it continued till 1947, at least politically, it continued till 1947. So I'll try to kind of share my thoughts on what really multilingualism is in the 19th century. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the colonial intervention that happened during the 19th century and what is happening to Calcutta. Of course, now it is Kolkata. Uh, and what is happening to 19th century Calcutta at that point of time, primarily because it's a very new city. And so what is happening in that new city has resonances and reverberations across the country because very soon it's going to become the capital of the colonial empire. Uh, and what the third thing that I'm going to talk about, again, very briefly, and these are just initial thoughts, initial notes. So I'll be very happy to have discussion at the end of this presentation, is the idea of print culture and authorship that comes into existence at this point of time. We know that the colonial times also saw almost an explosion of print media in different Indian languages, but also in English, and different sorts of scripts are now available technologically so that now you can have printed books which can be circulated widely. So there is mass reading, there is an increase in literacy, etc. So we'll also see how multilingualism kind of ties up with these notions of print cultures. I'll talk about a few authors. in the way from Bengal again, but I'm sure that you can think of similar authors from your own regions. And then I'll try to link it up all up to what is happening in the present and what is the role of multilingualism in today's times. So this is the general outline. So let's begin with the first point, which is multilingualism in the 19th century. Uh, Now, as I said, that Bengal at that point of time in the 19th century, because the British kind of, if you remember the history of this region, by 1765, the British almost captured what we now call, in those days called Bengal. But of course, it included Bengal, Bihar, Odisha, and some parts of Assam, not all of them, but parts of Assam that were on this side of the Brahmaputra. So you have a large territory that British come in possession of, and therefore this territory gets developed and it becomes a kind of a contact zone. Now, I'm using the word contact zone in the terms of what Mary-Louise Pratt calls a social space where disparate cultures meet, clash, grapple with each other. So obviously the British bring their own culture along, but there are also existing cultures that come in contact with each other in different ways. And because of this contact zone, because of this contact that happens at this point of time, you also have a multiple number of languages that come into existence. In fact, the British are astounded, uh, primarily because the colonial experience that they had in other countries before they start capturing India. Uh, you had, so for example, in Africa, these were mostly oral cultures, which were easy to suppress because the British brought writing into the system. But when they come to India, they realize that this is an ancient civilization, an ancient culture, which doesn't only have a spoken form, a multiple number of spoken forms, but also a very long history of writing, which I think sometimes we forget that writing is something that has been with us for a very long time. Though we sometimes call ourselves an oral culture, etc. So Shruti and Smriti are important in our culture. But there have been simultaneously accompanied by writing. So writing and scripts have been a part of our cultures for a very long time, right from very ancient civilizations, right from the Indus Valley, for example. So script is something that is always available in terms of dissemination of knowledge, in terms of production of knowledge, etc. And this is what really astounds the British. So, how do you deal with a civilization which has so many forms of languages? And not only so many forms of languages, but also these forms of languages have their distinctive scripts in some form or the other. Yeah. And therefore, this contact zone becomes an important and I think significant aspect during this period. So the British, what they do is they immediately, since they have become the rulers for the first time uh, over this vast region, they adopt the court language, which at that point of time was Persian, uh, but also, of course, start slowly introducing English. So now Persian and English, remember, was never the language of the masses, right? So the language of the masses was very different. But uh, Persian and English now become kind of part of the larger educational project. Persian, of course, disappears over 20, 25 odd years. English replaces Persian, at least in major official documentation. But these are the two languages that they focus on. Okay. I must again very strongly reiterate that the British have absolutely no interest in what they call the vernaculars. And I know the term is not a very uh, appropriate term. It was used in a very derogatory fashion earlier. So what we call regional languages today, they have absolutely no interest. So if you know about the early debate that happened between what we call Orientalists and Anglicists during this period, the debate is not really about regional languages. The debate is whether to use English, which Anglicists promoted in official communication and education, etc. And the Orientalists said that no, classical Indian languages should be used, Sanskrit, Arabic, Persian, etc. But they were not talking about regional languages at all. So the debate is not ever about regional languages. But because of this contact, and this is the argument that I am making, what happens is there is a massive explosion of regional languages themselves. And because of the spread of regional languages, along with the classical languages at the same time, there is a big, it's almost like a big potpourri. It's a huge boiling pot where different sorts of ingredients come in. And therefore, if we look at multilingualism in that sense, uh, though India has had a long civilizational, history of multilingualism, during this period it takes a very interesting form where all these forms of languages kind of interact with each other in this one contact zone, which is Calcutta, which slowly becomes the imperial capital, and therefore there is a huge amount of influx of people with different languages to this center. So you have a coming together of different languages within one center. So this is what starts happening. Now, if we keep this in mind, then let's go to the second point that I mentioned in my outline. So, how do you look at colonialism and what happens to Calcutta at that point of time? Again, Kolkata now. So, what the British keep producing is what we can call institutions. Okay. So there are different sorts of institutions that they produce, which produce again the contact of different sorts of languages. Yeah. Though their focus, remember, is again never the regional languages. And after a point of time, especially after 1830s and 40s, they even start, they use Sanskrit, for example, or Arabic or Persian for translations, for gaining knowledge, for appropriation of a certain kind of knowledge. And it's got a long history. If you know what translations did, there's going to be a session on translation, I know, after lunch. So I'm not going to spend much time on translation. I'm sure Professor Kaitkar is going to talk about it in greater details. But a translation does play a very strong appropriative role. So translations of classical texts during this period is mostly appropriative. So it's gaining of knowledge and sometimes claiming that knowledge as your own rather than acknowledging that knowledge as someone else's. So it had a very appropriative role during this period. But let's not get into translation. So what were the kind of institutions that the British built during this period, and which again produces the contact zone where different sorts of languages come together? So I'll take three examples, but we can keep on talking about it during our discussion. Now, one of the things that, of course, the British do is they start mapping the territory. So what we call the discipline of geography, for example, comes into existence at this point of time. Okay, and this is a very early map of Calcutta that was drawn by hand, as you can make out. And as you can see, it was a very small space within which a large amount of things were concentrated. So when the city was developing at that point of time. And I thought that this territorial nature of the city, this mapping of the city probably would also make us understand how these institutions that were around the city, and if you look at the map carefully, so you will see there is the Treasury Building, the Government House, the Central Telegraph Office, Dalhousie Square, etc. So all these places, all these things, institutions were concentrated in a single space, yeah? More or less around this central Calcutta, as we call it today. Now, as of course, these institutions started developing, they had different sorts of functions. And I think we need to understand those functionalities to understand how multilingualism operated within these institutions. The first kind of institutions that the British started building up was what we can call the axis of governance. Okay, so the pictures that you see over here, this is the Government House. It was built in 1803. This is now the Lok Bhavan, the erstwhile Raj Bhavan, where the governor used to stay. This is what is, it still exists. It's the courthouse. This picture is the writers' building, which was basically the clerical staff, which used to sit and conduct many of this thing. And this, the fourth picture again, is of writers' building. So you had this, though writers' building, the initial part of the writers' building also had a part of the Supreme Court. So you had the court structure. Why is this axis important in terms of, again, multilinguality? Because remember, in order to administer such a large area, the British needed to have a knowledge of the local languages. Though they tried initially for English and later replaced local languages with English in their courtrooms and in their governance, But in this initial period of contact, a large number of languages came into existence within this axis of governance. Okay, again, translation played an important role. So many of the texts, for example, would be in Braj. Many of the texts would be in Bangla. Many of the texts would be in Hindi, which are regional languages, remember. Many texts were available, for example, in Persian, Arabic, Sanskrit, etc. And these models that were available in these languages were then taken as models to govern. Okay? So, for example, the Indian Penal Code that we know was formulated just after this period to, and many of the penal code provisions were taken from earlier forms that are available. Okay, and these, of course, were mediated through translation in some way or the other. So the axis of governance, in other words, plays an important role in bringing languages together. Though remember, slowly the dominant language within this axis becomes English, okay, which is rather unfortunate, but that's what happens. And slowly the other languages start disappearing. But almost simultaneously, what also happens in the public sphere, away from the axis of governance, is an explosion of other languages. So what we call the modern Indian languages, for example, start exploding. So you have different forms of modern Indian languages that start exploding because they realize now that the axis of governance is being controlled by a monolingual form. So that monolinguality, we are kind of genetically coded into multilinguality. So multilinguality becomes the form of the public sphere in a certain way. The second axis that, of course, the British were extremely interested in was the axis of commerce. And again, the buildings that you see over here, this is the Exchange House, as it was called. It still exists. This used to be the Custom House, which was situated on the banks of the river Ganga, where the ships used to come and they used to pay taxes over here. And this is the what was known as the Exchange Court. All these buildings, the Custom House doesn't exist anymore, but all these buildings still exist. So Exchange Court was primarily where you had disputes. Now, one of the problems that, of course, the British faced is that how do you bring English law into a system which already had civilizational ways of understanding things, okay, of legality. And commerce, therefore, plays an important role in producing, again, this huge amount of contact zones. So remember, since Calcutta slowly starts developing into this commercial center, which later Mumbai becomes, what you have now is people from not only different parts of India, but different parts of the world coming over. Just a very quick story before we move on to the next axis. For example, Hariprabha Devi, in late 19th century, a lady who belonged to a well-to-do family in Calcutta, falls in love with a Japanese person who is working in the East India Company at that point of time. And that Japanese, she gets married to him. And during the First World War, because Japan is on the other side of the aisle, the British deport him. So Hariprabha Takeda at that point of time now, so she has become Hariprabha Takeda. She goes and settles down in Japan. Only after the war she comes back. Yeah. And she writes about her experiences. I just give you this example primarily because it's not simply different languages or multilinguality in India that produces this, but there are also multilinguality almost across nations. So you have Armenians who come and settle down in Calcutta, bring their own language and culture. You have Parsis who come and settle down in Calcutta because it's the center. You have people from Russia who have come and settled down in Calcutta, etc. So you have this, even it almost becomes a cosmopolitan center of different languages coming together. So this is one axis that one might need to explore to understand how commerce itself played an important role to produce multilinguality of a certain kind. The third, of course, was the axis of knowledge. Now, if you, again, let me explain the picture. So this is the Asiatic Society of Bengal. This is the Geological Survey of India. And the third is the Archaeological Survey of India. Now, all these institutions were formed in Calcutta. around the 1830s, 40s, 50s. So archaeological surveys, 1850s, etc. Now, again, so what do they do? So they again produce knowledge and store knowledge. Okay. Unfortunately for the British, the production and storage of knowledge is not in the language that they wish them to be. Yeah. It is in a language that is not English. And therefore, many of these institutions were also set up to appropriate a certain kind of knowledge, which again produces a certain kind of multilingual contact zone. So if you know Asiatic Society, the first president of Asiatic Society was William Jones. He was a judge of the Supreme Court. And William Jones, of course, along with translating many texts, also was a philologist. He studied languages and not simply Indian languages. Of course, he had grammars of Bengali, grammars, comparative grammars. I'll show you some examples later. But he also had a huge amount of interest in other world languages. Now, what these institutions do is, it's not simply uh, uh, limited to Indian languages. It's opening up Indian languages to other forms of languages that are available. And many of the publications of Asiatic Society about other languages, Jones's writing, for example, were often circulated in local journals. And this brings us to what really happened. So what is happening now is there is a mapping of the territory. So Calcutta of the 19th century becomes this zone where different sorts of territorial occupation happens, both in terms of knowledge, commerce, and in terms of coming together of different sorts of languages together. Yeah, so you have a space that is now inherently multilingual. So despite, of course, development of regional languages like Bangla and Odia and Assamese, etc., you now have a zone where it has been mapped as a multilingual space, despite all the efforts of British to make it a monolingual space. So it is probably, as I said, genetically kind of coded into us that we will remain multilingual, whatever we do in a certain form or the other. So this brings us to what I just mentioned at the end of the last sentence, is that how was this explosion happening? How did this multilinguality spread? Okay. And that brings us to the idea of print cultures. Now, one of the things that the British, of course, brought, remember, printing is not something new to our country. Printing had been there even before the British. The Portuguese brought it. The Dutch used printing. And Calcutta or Bengal as of the 19th century is an interesting space. So Calcutta, of course, is British. But if you travel down the river and go towards further towards north, there is a place that is called Chandannagar. Chandannagar was actually occupied by French. It's a very small town. Then you travel further north, you have another small town called Bandel. Bandel was controlled by the Dutch. Similarly, so you have all these other European powers, European colonial powers who are already there. And they, of course, brought the printing press with them. The Portuguese brought them first, and the printing had been there in the country for 200, 250 years. Now, what happened at this particular moment of time is interesting. So the picture that you see is the picture of what is known as the Baptist Mission Press. This was taken in the early 20th century, but it was founded in the year 1800. Now, what is the Baptist Mission Press? What it did was, so there was this gentleman called William Carey who came to India, but because the British rulers were Anglicans, they followed a certain kind of a church, they did not allow the Baptists to come into their territory. Now, Shirampur is a small town again, north of Calcutta, was controlled by the Dutch. So what William Carey did, though he was British, he settled down in Shirampur and he started a press over there. It was called the Baptist Mission Press, later called the Shirampur Press. And what Carey did in that press is therefore interesting for us to understand multilinguality again, is that till now, the printing presses that the Portuguese brought were capable of producing only texts in Latinate forms. Okay, so English, Portuguese. So if it is in Latin form, then it can produce it. Any other language, for example, if you go back to very early written texts which had more than 3 languages and had Indian languages, early, let's say late 18th century, early 19th century, you will see that the English part is printed, but the other parts are handwritten because the printing press could not print them. What Kerry, of course, does is he develops a technique which can print in Indian languages. Okay, though his initial goal and objective is actually to print the Bible in English languages for the sake of proselytization, conversion, etc. But the technology kind of travels, okay, and it reaches the printing areas of Calcutta. And this is what gives rise to what we call the multilingual print revolution. So from Calcutta, it travels to Assam. Now, Assam can produce texts in Ohomia. It travels to Orissa, where text can now be produced in Odia. It travels to the south in Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam. And slowly what happens is the regional languages get a boost. Because now you can express your opinions in languages that the British most probably won't even understand because they didn't even bother about them. Yeah? And this almost gives a fillip to the idea of multilingualism. So there are many languages, of course, everyone is aware of it, but now you have a print culture that can actually circulate these languages across borders. Just to give you an example again, Bankim's text, Anand Mat, within the first few years of its publications was immediately translated into many, many Indian languages. Okay. So this was something that was almost central. Now you can have a print form where different languages can be printed, circulated, debated, discussed, disseminated, etc. So this is one incident that I thought I'll just mention as as an afterthought, but also a major thought, right? So you can't even think about multilingualism during this period without thinking about print cultures that promoted it. The second example that I'm going to give, there are many examples, I'll just mention this. And the picture that you see over here is a college called Fort William College. It still exists. It's now an army base, but this building still exists. Now, what the Fort William College did was interesting because when the British came over here, they suddenly realized that they needed officers who could understand the Indian situation. So they started kind of importing officers from Britain, and they were completely lost when they came to India, primarily because they didn't know the languages. Yeah? So how do you talk to the local people? How do you solve local issues? So they established the Fort William College to uh, have officers who came, they were very young at that point of time, 16, 17-year-olds, who came to India and who were trained in this college for 1 year. It was kind of a training academy. And they were trained in not only the history of India, the British colonial rule, the laws and governance, etc., um, but also a series of languages. So this is what the language list of the first syllabus of Fort William College looked like. Yeah. So you of course have the classical languages, Arabic, Persian, Sanskrit, and this is from the actual syllabus. So you will find that the spellings are a bit different from the modern ones. They had to learn Bengali because Calcutta, Telinga, which is Telugu, Maratha, Tamil, Kannada. Okay. Along with, of course, modern languages of Europe, Greek, Latin, English classics. Now, for doing this, remember, they will have to have books, right? So you can't teach a language just by talking about it. So you need books. And that also gives a contact zone for multilinguality. So you have now multiple kinds of books, sometimes the same book containing multiple numbers of languages. Okay. So now you have dictionaries where you have 7 languages together. So you have English, you have Bengali, you have Marathi, you have Gujarati because the British Empire starts spreading, you have Tamil, you have Kannada in the same text. Okay. So when we think about that, how is multilingualism going to be spread in a diverse country like India? I mean, this experiment has already been done. So we have already seen that this was compulsory for the British. They were almost forced into it. Yeah, they of course studied English and Greek and Latin and all that. But because of the influx of all these languages together, the intellectuals or people who had access to education also had access to these kind of languages. And it was very common, therefore, for intellectuals to write not only in their own language. And I'll try to give you some examples from this. So these are the kind of textbooks that you see. So you have polyglot translations. These are the books that were used in Fort William College. You have dialogues in different languages. So if you have to say something in English, how do you say it in Bengali? How do you say it in Marathi? How do you say it in Gujarati, etc. So you have these texts which were produced by mostly William Carey's press, the Shirampur Mission Press. So let me come to the last part of the talk, thoughts, that not really a talk, but thoughts that. So if you look at the author, so I said print cultures and authorship. So if you look at the authors writing at that point of time, so many of you probably would know that Roy was instrumental. Well, he was the one who kind of said that English should be taught in India, etc. But Roy was also a prolific writer. So he wrote in English, he wrote in those days Hindustani, and he was a profound scholar of Persian. Okay. In fact, he published a newspaper which was called Miratul Akbar, which stopped after 1 year. He was the founder of the Brahmo Samaj, therefore he was very fluent in Sanskrit. In fact, if you know the history of Brahmo Samaj, many of the hymns that they chant uh, come from Sanskrit hymns. So he was a scholar of Sanskrit as well. And the book the picture that you see over here is actually one of his publications. It's called Tawawut ul Muhahidin. So towards the search for a single God, etc. So even in writing, because now you are in a contact zone, even in writing, you would have different sorts of languages or a multilinguality coming together. The second example, very quickly, is from the famous, Nobel Prize winning Rabindranath Tagore. Now, many people think that Rabindranath Tagore only wrote in Bangla, which is not true. He wrote in English as well. But not many people know that he also wrote in Braj Bhasha, Avdhi. And one of the texts that he, of course, produced is something called Bhanu Singher Padavali in Bhanu Singh Ke Padavali, which was written in Braj, okay, in the style of Meera and the Bhakti poets. So again, the same person writing in different languages and actually getting published and people reading them, people enjoying them. In fact, Padavali is a very common thing that we as children, at least my generation, would recite at homes because this was part of your growing up. Yeah. I'll move on to the final thing that I wanted to talk about because I think we're running out of time. People will be waiting for lunch. We also know that journalism plays an important role during this period. And if you, I'm sure that many of you are aware of this, that one of the first Hindi journals was published from Calcutta in 1826. It was called Udant Martand, so the Rising Sun. Though it did not last for a very long time, it stopped publication in 1827. So again, the examples that I'm giving you is to show that there are various kinds of languages that are getting together within the same space. So as a kind of a corollary to this brief history that I've tried to present, I'll come to the final thing and how do you link it to the I've given you a brief history of the past. I'll try to link it to the present. So what is happening in the present? And I'll call them some takeaways. And these are food for thought. And I'm sure that there'll be points for discussion that we can take up. Now, one of the key elements of NEP 2020 we know is this vision of multilingualism. So it's not simply multilingualism in general. Multilingualism, as I said, has always been a part of us genetically. I mean, we are multilingual by nature. but also as availability of, for example, books in multiple languages. So it's not that English should be seen simply as the language of knowledge, but the availability of books in different sorts of multiple languages. Now, how do you translate this vision into multilingualism? Now, one of the things that we keep on hearing every day is that we need institutional support structures, etc., which is important. I mean, we can't deny that you need institutional support structures. But I thought I'll share an example with you that many of these multilingual phenomenon that you saw in the 19th century were actually not supported by the British. They, in fact, actively made sure that such efforts were not made. Okay. They were basically supported by people who would get together. I'll give you an example of Bangla Academy, which was founded in the 1870s, late 1870s. And they didn't even think of asking for help from institutions, British institutions. Yeah. So a large number of intellectuals, families got together to set up Bangla Academy. And the goal of Bangla Academy was to promote the Bengali language, just like in what is modern Uttar Pradesh, you have the Nagri Pracharini Sabha, etc., which starts getting set up. Yeah. So languages in that sense. So to translate this vision, I think we also need to think not simply about institutional support, which is important, as I said, but also what kind of initiatives can we ourselves take, like it was taken in the 19th century, and how can we get together? Can we make a community of practice where we make sure that our engagement with languages is not simply restricted to our academic pursuits or non-academic pursuits, but also, let's say, actively engaging learning another Indian language? Can we do that? Are we capable of doing that? And I'm sure we are, because we are cognate languages, and it should not be too difficult for us to learn another Indian language I mean, it should not be too strenuous for us in that sense. And this also, of course, stems from this idea that like in the 19th century, remember, there was a hierarchy. So English was at the top. And through the axis of governance, axis of commerce, axis of knowledge, the British kind of made sure that English remains on the top. And the way that NEP 2020 visualizes multilingualism is a non-hierarchical system of languages. So you have a de-hierarchized system of languages. It's where you don't say that this is top, this is better and this is less. And it is only through this realization that languages are based on the idea of equality and equity, and they organically grow, as in the 19th century, maybe we'll be able to translate this vision into reality. And I hope that all of us get together in doing it. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for hearing so patiently to me. And I'll be more than happy to discuss.
Well, thank you very much, sir. Your sessions are always not only hold the audience, they give them some very important information and characterized by some pictures which are historical. Uh, uh, I think this was an interesting session, beginning with how Kolkata becomes the colonial capital, and then how multilingualism then becomes a colonial norm in a way that translation, for example, plays a significant role. British officials needing to know a lot of languages, the whole print culture, promoting multilingualism. Uh, then there's this Chandan Nagar, this college, Fort William College, where training in multilingual ways. I mean, the training used to be multilingual and then brings out these texts which are multilingual, dictionaries, and then this whole culture of multilingualism is promoted. Uh, and finally, we could look at these present. So it was very informative and inspiring session, sir. Thank you very much. Now, if the audience has some questions, which I'm sure you should have, if you were carefully listening to what he said, we'll take one or two quick questions and then, yes, Sanju. Cordless. Brief. Directly ask the question. Yeah. Don't set the context. Questions. सीधी बात. You have to be question. Yeah, frame it. Go ahead.
So, sir,
Yeah, you are.
so you have discussed governance, commons, and knowledge. So my question is what about religion? English language came into frame by Charles Lamb, if I'm not wrong, in 1792. From 1792, there was a kind of movement which was to personalize Indian people. And it was not actually, initially, it was not, it didn't get that success. But in 1813 Chartered Act, it was clearly mentioned that missionaries are allowed to personalize Indian people, including this language. And after 1813, many missionary schools were established. There was a, and if I'm not forgetting, there was a person called Alexander Duff. And he came up with that idea, and under his guidance, many schools, missionary schools were established. The primary language was English. Even in that, Bengal. So that's from 1813 to even now, that we are now having that linguistic individualism. So English had a primary goal to personalize people. How can we forget that? So that was my question.
If I get your question right, you're saying that English was primarily used for proselytization. I don't know. I mean, yes, it was. So the answer to that is yes. But answer to that is that it was only used for proselytization is probably a bit more complicated. Because remember, the British government and the East India Company, at least in 1857 and 1858, before the Indian Empire was handed over to the Crown, they very actively discouraged missionaries, very actively. And there is a huge amount of documentation on that, because they really hated the idea that missionaries are opening schools, and they were not really interested in education. So though many people keep on debating even today, especially in English studies departments, that the British brought education. No, they were not interested in education. They actually very actively engaged in making sure that people don't learn English at all. So, and that's a stated fact. Was English used for proselytization? Yes, it was. So if you look at the history of the Northeast, for example, the American Baptist Mission, which reached the Northeast in Manipur and Assam, it was very common that most of the texts, the local languages, since many of them did not have scripts, started disappearing. And that is another present that we need to understand. So why do you think, for example, in Manipur, Meitei Maik, the script form has made a comeback? Yeah, though it uses Romanized script form. So I would say that yes, it was partially used for proselytization, but it requires a longer and more complex answer. It was not really just a tool for proselytization.
All right. If there is a brief question, yes. Otherwise, we would conclude the session because we'll have to keep brief with time.
So can I have a counter question?
No, you cannot have a counter question. Sir will be available for a discussion some other time. We will make a session.
If it is brief, you can ask. If it's too brief, you can take more questions. So, if it was not, so in Oxford, English language introduced in 1894, if I'm not wrong, And in Cambridge itself, English was introduced in 1911 to have knowledge, to have commercial purpose. But in India, if you see, that many books were Indian religion books, scriptures were translated in English to make Indian people read their scriptures in English. So that was the question only.
That is true. I mean, that I agree with completely. You're absolutely right. And this is not simply all that happens in 1892. I mean, it happens even earlier than that. So if you look at the history of the Asiatic Society, which is formed in 1774, so 100 years or maybe 120 years before Oxford even introduces English. So 1774 onwards, I mean, Asiatic Society is not simply production of knowledge. It's also, so that's why I said that Professor Ketkar is going to talk about it in post-lunch. So I'm not going to touch on that much. But remember, Asiatic Society does a huge amount of translations, huge. And these translations, let me tell you a story since you mentioned this. So Vidyasagar, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar is, he becomes the head of the school board. At that point of time, he's appointed as the head of the school board. And as a textbook of English, he wants to introduce Shakuntalam, right? Because Shakuntalam has now been translated. The textbook board rejects it by saying that Shakuntalam, though it has been translated into English, cannot be used as a textbook because it contains a lot of obscenity and it will destroy the morals of the people. Okay, so you can see the irony of the situation. So it's not simply that something happens in 1892 in Oxford. It has been there for a very long time. So you might have to go back in history a bit to understand what is happening at that point of time.
Well then, thank you very much, sir, once again for your time. I'm sure the participants have learned and got inspired to research further. With this, we come to an end of this plenary talk. And as all of you know, we would now go for lunch. Thank you all very much. Have a great lunch ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi, and have a wonderful lunch.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you. We'll miss you.
See you later.